Welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I'm Kate Dickerson. Today's episode is a conversation I had with Allison Gardner, an associate professor of arthropod vector biology at the University of Maine. I met Allie quite a few years ago when we had an MSF pop-up event at the Maine Discovery Museum that was focused on building with biology. Allie's love of entomology was evident then, just as it is in this episode. It was fun to touch base with Allie and to get an update on her research. We spoke in January 2025, and I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. At Maine Savings, we believe in building brighter futures, both for our members and the communities we serve. That's why we're proud to support initiatives like the Maine Science Podcast, celebrating innovation, discovery, and creativity right here in the Pine Tree State. Whether you're dreaming of your next big idea or planning for your financial goals, we're here to help you find your path. Visit mainsavings.com to learn how we go beyond banking. Maine Savings, supporting our community's curiosity and innovation, one episode at a time. Allie, welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. It is a delight to have you here. We met some number of years ago when I pretty much cold called you and said, we're doing this thing about building with biology, which I thought was really cool. I would love to hear your path to, I love your topic on your website is medical entomology, which I'm quite sure is a new phrase for an awful lot of people. I know in the past you have talked at length about how much you love insects, which is great. I'm glad there's people out there in the world who do. I don't mind them. I'm just not in love with them. So I would love to know, how did you get there?
Yeah, so medical entomology, for those who aren't familiar, is basically the study of insects. And we also expand that to include other arthropods as well that transmit pathogens, either infectious disease of humans, or also sometimes we consider wildlife, livestock, companion animals within the scope of medical entomology as well. So I actually got interested in medical entomology a long time ago, all the way back when I was in high school. I was involved in this research program that my high school had, where they tried to help students get placements to work in research labs on a topic of personal interest. Really a great high school program that absolutely changed the course of my entire professional trajectory. I was interested in mosquitoes initially because at the time I was very into horseback riding. I guess I still am. And West Nile was affecting a lot of horses in the local stables. This was in the late 90s, early 2000s when the initial West Nile outbreak was occurring in New York, where I grew up. And so I wound up doing a lab placement while I was a high school student, similar to what students do through the Upward Bound program and things like that at UMaine. And I worked in the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station, which is a big research program that's focused on medical entomology. That was in the early 2000s. And then the interest kind of stuck. But it initially, came about just through the impact that vector-borne disease, both West Nile and Lyme disease, were having in the community where I grew up.
So you said it totally changed your trajectory. What were you thinking before that?
Yeah, to be honest, I had never really started to envision a career as a professional scientist before that early lab experience. I've always loved reading and writing, and I never really thought of science as a career path that was going to involve so much of that. When I was younger, I often thought that I was likely to go into a humanities discipline. I actually was a history major as an undergraduate, and I always thought that I was going to go into a field that I think people more kind of immediately associate with writing. And it was actually in the course of that initial lab internship that I began to realize, as I started to read the scientific literature and do a little of my own scientific writing, I realized that this was a career path that could appeal to both that longstanding interest in reading and writing that I had, as well as, I really enjoyed just the process of scientific inquiry, the data analysis that came with it, the time that I was able to spend outdoors working in the field. So it really all started to coalesce for me, back in high school and in college through those early research experiences that I had.
How hard was it to go from a bachelor's degree in history into a pretty hardcore science field for a PhD?
Yeah, I actually tell people often that I feel that my history degree really has served me well as a professional natural scientist. Not only has history stayed a large part of my life and really influenced the way that I think about scientific progress and scientific developments today, but there was a lot of reading and writing that was involved in that major and a lot of critical thinking. These are all really important skills as a scientist as well. And in some ways, when I moved into my PhD program and I was studying biology for a degree for the first time, I felt like I was a little bit behind some of the other students, in terms of the kind of foundational knowledge. And there was, a bit of catch up that I had to do through my coursework. But in other ways, I really felt like I was a bit ahead of the curve, having spent so much time in a discipline that involves such a large volume of reading and writing routinely as part of assessment. And I felt that my writing skills really translated over very quickly into the scientific career path. And that remains one of the areas of the career path that I enjoy the most, even to this day.
So it's interesting. You mentioned your initial love or interest in science was mosquitoes, which is how you and I crossed paths. So we were doing this program at the museum/science festival, building with biology. And if I remember right, the presumption kind of was like, how would we defend against mosquitoes and vector-borne diseases? And I had the audacity during that session to basically promote specieside and say I would be totally fine if we didn't have mosquitoes. They cause so much harm. And from a very human perspective, I don't see a lot of benefit to mosquitoes. And when I think about the harm that they cause, as you mentioned, through West Nile virus and other things, but also the deep human impact of malaria in particular, not to mention other diseases. Do you still do any work with mosquitoes, or have you really switched over to ticks and much more focused on the pretty significant issues we have in Maine with insects?
Yeah, so we absolutely do still work with mosquitoes. Got actually a number of different species that we're working on in the lab right now, not just the mosquitoes, the black-legged tick. We also are working on winter tick now, and we're working on stable flies and kind of a new veterinary entomology area that one of my graduate students has been opening up. So we work on a pretty broad scope, but we are still working on the mosquitoes. The mosquitoes, if anything, have become an even more significant problem from a medical perspective since I arrived at UMaine. We crossed paths very quickly after I arrived at UMaine back in 2016. And at the time, I was envisioning carry on with this research that's going to be in the context of these species of medical significance, even if there isn't much virus transmission going on local to the area. But over the last summer and over the past couple of summers, we've really seen an uptick in West Nile virus. My lab is involved in mosquito surveillance for the Maine CDC. And so we collect samples largely around Bangor, submit them for pathogen analysis done through the state. And we've seen these upticks in West Nile and Eastern equine encephalitis, in Jamestown Canyon virus, which is another encephalitis virus that I think tends to be a little less familiar to people. And so if anything, mosquitoes have become even more relevant within the past 10 years or so that I've been living in the area. We're definitely still working on it.
And you do ticks. I think it's hard to be an entomologist in this day and age, certainly in the Northeast, and not have that as a concern. And especially if you're at a land-grant university where you mentioned wildlife as well. I don't know if you do wildlife. I've spoken with other people who, that's part of how they're tracking it and taking care of it. How much overlap is there in understanding how diseases are spread with mosquitoes versus how they're spread with ticks?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. And I think that there are some conceptual similarities in the sense that both are arthropod vectors. And so we've got a lot of consideration of the vector life cycle as part of the study of these pathogens. Both of them also transmit a lot of zoonotic diseases, meaning that they have a wildlife origin, and then the vector can bring them over into human populations, even if the virus can cause illness in humans, even if the virus doesn't, whatever pathogen we're talking about, doesn't amplify in humans. And so there are those similarities. Both mosquito-borne and tick-borne disease are often highly connected to wildlife communities in addition to human populations. But there are some very key differences, I would say, between studying mosquitoes and studying ticks. For one thing, the mosquitoes have a very short life cycle. Typically an entire mosquito's life cycle will take place over 2 to 3 months, depending on the species and the sex of the mosquito. They might parasitize and bite a really large number of hosts during that time, but it's a very short life cycle. And ticks, on the other hand, here typically have a 2-year life cycle. So it's a much longer life cycle. The ways that ticks interact with hosts are very different from mosquitoes in that mosquitoes will bite you once and then fly away. Ticks have a more intimate association with the host in that they're attached to the host, sometimes for a period of days or even weeks while they're feeding, depending on the species. And then another key difference, I'd say, between mosquitoes and ticks is the types of environments that they inhabit. A lot of our disease vector mosquito species have really adapted to the human environment. And, they use for breeding, for example, artificial container habitats that are man-made, created by humans. And so in some ways, mosquito-borne disease systems are extremely tightly coupled with human activities in a very explicit way, whereas ticks are more associated with forest communities and wildlife communities, which of course are also very heavily modified by humans, which is one of actually the key research avenues I've been working on in the context of tick-borne disease. But you associate their habitat more with quote unquote natural ecosystems rather than these very explicitly man-made habitats. So yeah, there are some key kind of conceptual and logistical differences with studying the two species.
So pick one of those two, dealer's choice here. What is your research specifically looking at for one of those species?
Yeah, so let me talk about ticks a little bit since we've spoken about mosquitoes already. So the focus of my lab's research right now in the context of tick-borne disease is how the ways that humans manage the forest impact both the tick life cycle and the pathogen transmission cycles that ticks are involved with. There are a lot of different things that landowners want to do with their forests here in Maine, right? Some people want to use their forest for recreation or hunting. Some people, are very invested in kind of trying to turn a profit from their woods, and they might be involved in timber harvesting for like small scale commercial purpose. Some people own land for a really long time in their family, and they don't have a particular desire to manage it at all. So what people do with their land is really variable, but it really impacts very much, whether intentional or not, wildlife communities, as well as the type of habitat that's available for ticks, during the 90% of the life cycle that they aren't actually parasitizing a host. And so what people are doing really matters a lot for our tick-borne disease transmission risk. Often people aren't aware of it. And areas of the state where over 80% of land is privately owned. So it really matters, what these private landowners are doing. Often they're not aware of the impacts of their management decisions on tick-borne disease. And so an important thread, like an important dimension of my research over the past 10 years or so at UMaine has been collaborations with social scientists who study more how landowners think and how landowners behave and why, and how can we educate people. So we're kind of approaching this problem of tick management and private land and forest management and the intersection of the three from both biophysical perspectives, which is primarily led in my lab, as well as these more like human dimensions oriented perspectives.
That's a lot of variables. Let's take someone who uses their lands primarily for, walking trails, hiking, recreation, a little bit of management from the perspective of cutting down so that it's a managed land. What are best practices for reducing human interaction with ticks?
Yes. One of the research areas that we're working on now that I think is really interesting and kind of promising, some potential for some ecological and human health wins here, is the relationship between invasive plants and ticks. It's been demonstrated in a lot of different systems, both a lot of different invasive plant species and different tick species around North America, that there does seem to be this link between ticks and invasive plants, where in areas where you have more invasives, you tend to have more ticks in the environment. So managing invasive plants is obviously not a trivial task at all, but it is, I think, a very practical way of reducing the tick burden on your property. Right now, I have an active research project along with my colleagues, Jessica Leahy and Tim Waring at UMaine, as well as some collaborators at Vermont State University, where we're working on developing more like practical guidelines for landowners, like how much in the way of invasive plants do you need to remove to see an impact on the tick populations? If you remove invasive plants in one area of your property, does that lead to like area-wide reductions in tick population size elsewhere on your property or on your neighbor's property where management hasn't necessarily been conducted? So there are a lot of open questions about implementation of invasive plant removal as a strategy to mitigate tick bite risk. But I do think it's really promising because we've got this situation where, a lot of landowners care about invasive plants as well. It's another really important problem in our forest ecosystem. They care about ticks. And so it's interesting to see these like synergies that sometimes exist we're confronting one of the environmental problems can simultaneously address another environmental and human health problem.
Do you have any idea why there seems to be that linkage?
I have a few different ideas, and this is part of what we're exploring in our current research that's just starting out. I think that there are really two different pathways by which invasive plants could impact the ticks. One is a more host-driven pathway, and one is a more microclimate-driven pathway. We know that the different wildlife species kind of respond differently to invasive plants. So like two of the important hosts in the tick life cycle, for example, are white-tailed deer and white-footed mice. The mice tend to be hosts as well as like pathogen reservoirs that are actually going to transmit pathogens to ticks. And then the deer are important because, hundreds of adult ticks can be parasitizing deer simultaneously, and deer are really poor at grooming them off. And so the deer interact with different invasive plant species in different ways. Sometimes like the berries or the leaves will be like good forage for the deer. And so you'll start to get deer aggregating around the invasive plants, which could lead to more ticks coming into the habitat. The mice are often able to use the invasive plants as protection against predators, because like you look in some of these invasive plant infestations, they are really, really dense. It's hard for predators of mice to like make their way into them just because it's such a complex, dense habitat. And so if you have like rodents seeking refuge in invasive plants, that can potentially lead to both higher tick densities and higher infection prevalence if the mice are the principal hosts that are available to them. And then at the same time, again, because of the structure of the invasive plants, that we really don't see anything quite so similar in native plants, you often have a very moist, dark microhabitat available to the ticks that are seeking hosts associated with invasive plants. And that can really prolong the longevity of the ticks, so we hypothesize at least. The ticks are very sensitive about moisture. They desiccate easily. That's really the easiest way to kill ticks, to dry them out. Why we always say, run your clothes through the dryer when you get back in from hiking. And so when they're in these kind of protected habitats, because of the density of the plants where there's a relatively high moisture content, that can enable them to survive longer, give them more opportunity to find a host or more opportunity to encounter a human.
I think from all the other folks I've talked to, climate change is having a really big impact on the migration of plants and invasives.
Yeah.
So let's assume for a minute that it's confirmed 100% that there's the linkage with the plants, which it seems like you're leaning towards. And how do you manage that when that then becomes the new environment? I realize I am probably 5 years ahead on the research on this. You must think about that because we are changing the environment as well. It's almost a cliche that is overused at this point, which is, building the airplane while we're flying it. You must have that in mind while you're trying to design these projects.
Yeah, it is really interesting. Like even within the past 10 years that I've been working in Maine, the environment for ticks has changed really staggeringly rapidly. I remember when I first came to UMaine and started working in Orono, we never do research projects in Orono because the tick densities were relatively low here. It was hard to do a research project. We needed to look for areas that had more significant tick densities in order to be able to do this sort of environmental research. And so I remember for my first few projects, when I moved to Maine, we actually were working mostly in southern Maine. We had students staying in the dorms at USM over the summer, and we were working down in the southern parts of the state because we just didn't have terribly high tick densities here. Completely different story now. For better or for worse, sort of the double-edged sword of being a medical entomologist, we're now working in Orono routinely because we're able to use the university woods because these places are just chock full of ticks at this point. And so the changing distribution of ticks, like in real time, as we're working on these problems is very real to me and really affects where we conduct research and how we conduct research and what types of questions we're asking. And so I think you're absolutely correct. The environmental context is just constantly changing. Invasive plants are going to become a larger problem, harder to keep in check over time, despite, all these great efforts that are going on in the government and at the university to keep the problem under control. And so I really think one of the challenges working as a medical entomologist is that you need to be looking at multiple different tactics and avenues simultaneously for how are we going to control the problem. Some of the tactics are going to be things like vegetation management, like that sort of environmental management practices. We also are studying chemical control of ticks. This is certainly something that people do in the state. And we've got another arm of our research program that's designed to evaluate the effectiveness of different chemical products. How often do they need to be used? We're always looking for what's the minimum that you need to use a chemical product to have the desired impact for public health while reducing potential negative impact on the environment, because there are trade-offs, of course, with all these strategies, money, efficacy, other externalities. And then we also have, again, strands of our research that deal with modifying human behavior. I think one of the best ways to protect ourselves against ticks is simply by engaging routinely in personal protective behaviors. But many people will acknowledge when you ask them that they don't. They know that performing tick checks or wearing pants over the summer are good ways to prevent tick bites, but there's a lot of different barriers to actually doing these practices. And so we've got another strand of our research that doesn't deal with ticks or the environment per se at all, but rather we're just trying to understand, what motivates people to engage in these best practices to protect themselves, and what are the barriers, and how can we try to make these approaches more accessible to people. So a lot of different avenues, I think, need to be considered simultaneously.
As someone who loves hiking personally and hates hiking with pants and would much rather do it in shorts, I would imagine that changing human behavior has got to be among the worst and hardest approach.
And, I'm in the same boat as you. I very often don't engage in those protective behaviors myself. And me as a professional entomologist, who I think is as aware as anyone of the threat that's posed by these pathogens in this area of the country, it's hard. There are a lot of different barriers to engaging in behaviors and very reasonable trade-offs that people need to weigh. The discomfort of hiking in the heat wearing pants versus the potential risk of ticks. When it comes to the insecticides, the potential to release PFAS into the environment versus, again, the public health burden. And so I think it's a challenging but very interesting research area. How do people weigh all these trade-offs? I don't think that there's necessarily right or wrong answers either. And so it's an interesting research area, one that my collaborations have really opened my eyes to over the past 10 years.
Yeah, I bet. If I think about it, if I would go out hiking 15 years ago, it just wouldn't even occur to me to wear pants. But now I will think about it. And if we're going somewhere where I know ticks are a really big issue, I will. It's not my default. And I think it's only because we've had a significant number of friends of ours have Lyme disease and know the deep impact of tick-borne disease. And they're not fun diseases to get.
Yeah, and it's interesting. And I feel like here in Maine, I feel like I'm in a bit of a time capsule, because where we're at here in Maine right now is basically the same place that the area of New York where I grew up was 30 years ago. We were still jumping in leaf piles and things when I was a kid there, which is something I would never do in New York at this point. And I feel like Maine is going through, on a slight delay, that sort of transition period right now that I grew up with further south, where we're now seeing these tick burdens on the rise, and people are figuring out how are they going to have to change their behavior? How are they going to adapt to the problem? Because it is something that we're going to be living with. I don't have any kind of illusions that this is a problem that we're going to be able to completely eliminate through environmental management.
Are you looking at all at ticks themselves and kind of how they themselves spread these diseases? Or is that, for the most part, really well known, and now it's just the interaction and what diseases are being carried?
Yeah. So my lab has done a decent amount of research on the tick life cycle. We've got research being led by different members of the lab. One of the postdocs in my lab right now, Dr. Lydia Fai, is leading a project that's focused on ticks and climate change. So we've been doing research on the impacts of weather and climate and environmental conditions on the tick life cycle. My lab hasn't been considering as much pathogen transmission dynamics. We're more focused on the biology of the vector and the environmental context of transmission. But there are a lot of interesting questions out there that are being explored at UMaine that deal with different strains of pathogens, different hosts of pathogens, and how all of this scales up to prevalence of tick-borne disease in human populations. So my colleague at UMaine Cooperative Extension, Dr. Tom Rounsville, is leading a lot of research right now. He's mainly focused on different strains of Borrelia, as well as he's working on Babesia microtia, which is the agent of babesiosis, another tick-borne pathogen that's becoming more important in the state. And he's interested in finding out why we see certain types of strains of tick-borne pathogens emerging in different areas of the state. Are some of these strains, more pathogenic to humans than others? Do some ticks carry multiple strains? What are the implications of all this for the severity of illness that you see in humans as a result? And so there is, I think, a lot of interesting and important basic research to be done in that arena as well. And it's great to see colleagues here at UMaine who are working in that area too.
How often does the baton get passed to your group? I mean, like someone's doing the basic research and they figured it all out, and then you guys kind of pick it up and say like, okay, so now where are we seeing it? How can we help prevent it? Does that happen?
I don't know if it happens in quite that fashion. I will say that, there's a lot of people working on tick-borne disease in the state, and it's an extremely collaborative group. I have loved working on vector-borne disease in the state because there are so many people who are invested in the area and have different expertise and are very committed to sharing information and kind of approaching problems together. So like Maine Health Research Institute is the lab that's led by Rob Smith, is the lab that's had the longest record of working on tick-borne disease in the state. And when I first arrived at UMaine, I actually was a little bit nervous about what the interactions with that group was going to be like. It's a very well-known group in the entomology community. And I thought, how are they going to feel as to this newcomer who is showing up in Maine and hasn't really worked on ticks before? And how is this going to play? But those folks were just so welcoming to me. And, straight off the bat, we were collaborating with each other, Rob and Susan Elias, Chuck Lubelczyk. So that's been a great group to work with. Of course, we work very closely with the folks at Cooperative Extension, since those are our partners here in Orono. And then we also work routinely with the state agencies, Maine CDC and the epidemiologists there, the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry as well. So I wouldn't say that there's so much like a passing of baton on research problems as just a constant sharing of information and finding out like who is best placed, both in terms of expertise and logistically, to address problems as they emerge. Just yesterday, I was on a call with Chuck where we were talking about the mosquito and tick sampling approach that we're going to have this summer and coordination of that. And so I think that, it's sometimes hard to like define where like one lab is beginning and another lab is ending because the collaboration can be so great.
That's a much better visual than passing the baton that I was going for. That's really neat. It's this whole Venn diagram overlap thing instead. All right, I'm not going to make you pick your favorite current research project because that's unfair. And I feel like I have at least a little bit better sense of what it is that you're looking at. Of the projects that you got going with your lab, and I didn't ask, how big is your lab at this point?
So right now we've got 6 graduate students, a postdoc, 2 research associates, and over the summer we typically have somewhere between like 5 and 10 undergrads as well. So a lot of students, full house.
That is a lot of students. Holy mackerel. All right. Are there areas that you are really looking into in the next couple of years that you're not there yet? Based on the work that you're doing now, like what areas are you really interested in finding out more about? And that can be specific diseases. It can be different approaches.
Yeah. So there are a couple areas that I'm really looking forward to. First of all, in the non-tech research, we've definitely been expanding. My position was actually new when I came to UMaine. There wasn't a medical entomologist whose position I was filling, like it wasn't a retirement hire or anything like that. And it was clear to me when I came here that the reason the position existed was because people have been looking for solutions related to tick-borne disease. And so I knew when I first arrived here that tick-borne disease was going to be a major focus of my lab. It was the need of the state that we needed to address straight off the bat. And so a lot of my initial research at UMaine focused on black-legged ticks. And of course, we're continuing to work on black-legged ticks, and there's new projects starting all the time. But one of the things that I'm looking forward to that's just starting now and continuing over the next few years is expanding into, and in some cases, re-expanding into other medical and veterinary pest species. So I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, I recently started a collaboration with Pauline Kameth, who's been working on winter tick extensively and parasites of moose extensively over the past 10 years. She and I arrived at UMaine at the same time, but for some reasons that completely elude me, we haven't really had a collaboration up until this point. And so we're co-advising a master's student right now, Donnie Cinderson, who's doing some work on the impact of extreme weather conditions on winter tick ecology behavior. And so working on winter tick is something that I'm looking forward to continuing. Alyssa Ballman, who is a PhD student and our lab manager, who I've been working with for the past 6 years, has opened up a whole new research avenue that's more veterinary entomology that's related to the impact of stable flies on horses. And as part of that research, it's a very interdisciplinary project where she's trying to understand the phenology of stable flies and what's responsible for that, weather conditions. She's evaluating these little sporadic mites that basically parasitize flies as a potential biological control agent for the stable flies, which is a really interesting avenue. And she's also doing some work on the impact of the flies on equine behavior. So this is another research avenue. I've never worked in veterinary entomology before. Alyssa is a very avid horsewoman, and she really opened up this door to me. And so I'm looking forward to seeing where that work goes. And then, of course, we've been continuing with the mosquitoes as well. I have a PhD student, Meg Shire, who's been working on kind of different approaches for monitoring mosquitoes. She's been leading some work over the past couple of years using eDNA. And this is also a collaboration with Karen James and Mike Kinnison, using eDNA to detect mosquitoes or mosquito DNA in aquatic habitats. So that's another research avenue that I'm excited to see where it goes. So yeah, I'm looking forward to continuing the work with ticks and this invasive plant grant that I have now along with my colleagues. But I'm also really just excited to be expanding more into other non-black-legged tick species of medical and veterinary significance.
It'll be really interesting as you move forward with some of these to see what kind of overlap there is with the way management or the rest of the ecosystem around those different species, if it's the same kind of idea how things get managed and or passed along. I imagine it's like what I asked before about ticks and mosquitoes, that there's some overlap, but then there's some things that really are not at all. But it'll be interesting to think about what is the overlap.
Yeah. And I think that that's the holy grail, right? To be able to find like some generalizable principles that can extend across all of these different disease systems. I think that the glue that's going to hold a lot of this together is the human impacts on the environment and how the ways that we modify the environment and the ways that we behave come to bear on all of these different insect or arthropod systems. And that's another research area that I'm really interested in continuing to explore. I actually did my sabbatical last year. I had my first sabbatical at UMaine, and I went and did a master's degree in behavior science during the sabbatical because I've been kind of inspired by all these social science collaborations that I've been involved in. And I've been getting increasingly interested in what's the role of human behavior in determining how we interact with and facilitate in some fashion all of these species of medical concern. And so that's another area that I'm really hoping to continue to pursue. And I think it'll be relevant across all of these different systems.
I love that you took your sabbatical to get a master's degree. That is the first time I've ever heard that. That is really great. Any thoughts or concerns about what we, as, the hardest research project of all, changing human behavior, what we should be on the lookout for, or maybe think about more, or tips on how to really protect ourselves beyond what we all already know? And maybe this isn't an entirely fair question, but you are thinking about it. So I'm curious if you have any new thoughts or new ways to get us to think about that.
I think one of the challenges that we're dealing with here is how can people make decisions in an evolving information environment? Because one of the problems with managing tick-borne disease and some of these other systems as well is that the scientific information base is not perfect, right? We don't have a magic bullet solution for how to control tick-borne disease. And yet it's a problem that is very real, that's occurring now, that people have to respond to. And I think part of the difficulty that individuals face and that communities face is simply identifying what is the best set of practices that's going to work in our situation, given that the scientific knowledge is imperfect. And to me, that's a really big question to grapple with. How can we use scientific information when there's uncertainty around it? And it's not just a situation that we're facing in the context of vector-borne disease. We're dealing it with PFAS, with harmful algal blooms, lots of environmental problems that exist right now. They're very real. We need to respond to them immediately, but we don't necessarily know what is the best way to go about this. And sometimes there's confusion because the scientific knowledge base is evolving. And I think, for example, we saw that very clearly during COVID. It felt like there's whiplash in 2020, like you don't need to wear masks. Oh, yes, you do. Actually, you should be wearing two. And they should be these very specific types of masks. And so it felt like there was a little bit of confusion about, well, what are we supposed to do? And why are we getting different information at different times and from different sources? So I think that that's like a big challenge in this kind of human behavior vein that we need to start thinking about. How does scientific knowledge get adopted? And especially when it's not perfect. So to me, like that's a big challenge that we're going to have to confront moving ahead. And I know that there are people at UMaine who are working on this, like Caroline Noble comes to mind, all her great work in the PFAS system, Rachel Chapman. There are people working on this question of like, how do you work with information that's not perfect? And it's something that we're really going to have to confront, I think, in these vector-borne disease systems.
But that's actually a really good point for those of us who are either admirers of science, advocates for science, interested in science, or just general people. Like part of what we all have to remember is science isn't perfect. It's the best answer we have right now. So it is unfair to say, tell me exactly what to do right now and expect it not to change. So the more that we can help people understand, why do we have that whiplash? Well, because scientists figured it out. And the mask is a complicated example because it did become such a hot button topic. But I will say, like, the reason a lot of our approaches to different things like wildlife management and land management and all these things have changed is because of the work that people like you do to help us better understand the system, which I would like to think we could all approach as saying, oh, science wasn't wrong. It's just an iterative process. And we forget that. And this is part of the reason I had these conversations. So there's my soapbox. All of the listeners who haven't heard it in a couple of episodes, I just think it's really important for scientists to figure out how to use that and how to make those decisions when you don't have all the information you want. But it's just as important for those of us who aren't doing the science to recognize that that's what you have to do in the moment and that things might change. So I think it has to be a two-way street. That would be a really cool human behavior thing to think about. Like, how do you get to the point where you can have that be almost a dialogue between the scientific community and others? I don't know.
And it requires a lot of trust, I think, on both parts to be able to engage in that conversation in a productive way.
Well, I'd like to think we started it here, Allie. So I think we should call it a day for this conversation and perhaps to be continued. And I really do appreciate you letting me put you on the spot so many years ago when you were an assistant professor. And I think we're lucky to have you at Maine. I'm really glad that you're doing the work you're doing. I'm totally psyched you got your master's degree on sabbatical. That is the life goal I hadn't thought I wanted to see happen, but it's pretty great. And I really appreciate all that you've been doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak.
Thanks for listening to the Maine Science Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by following us on your podcast platform of choice. And please leave a rating and review. It will help more people find us and help spread the word about some of the remarkable people doing science in Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is recorded at Discovery Studios at the Maine Discovery Museum in Bangor, Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is executive produced and hosted by me, Kate Dickerson, and edited and produced by Scott Loiselle. And the Discover Maine theme was composed and performed by Nick Parker.